He grabbed the guard's rifle, convinced it was all just a joke. But a second later, a shout rang out, and the barrel was suddenly in his face. Now only the internet was laughing. London, Buckingham Palace. The square in front of the palace was packed with tourists. People were taking pictures of the majestic facades, admiring the massive golden gates, buying souvenirs, and eating ice cream. Street musicians played classical pieces on their violins, creating an almost fairy tale atmosphere. The air carried the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, blending with the light scent of morning rain. But as always, the biggest attraction was the royal guards. Tall, imposing figures in red tunics and massive bearskin hats stood at the palace entrance, motionless as if carved from stone. Their rigid posture, perfectly aligned arms, and unwavering gaze created an aura of absolute steadfastness. Every tourist who came here understood these were not just soldiers. They were symbols of Britain, a living testament to discipline, honor, and tradition that had withstood the test of time. Some people instinctively spoke in hushed tones as they approached. Others stopped a few steps away, feeling a quiet reverence for these men. But not everyone. There was always someone who didn't understand boundaries. He emerged from the crowd suddenly, a tall, fit young man with a perfect haircut, expensive sneakers, and a designer backpack, a smartphone in one hand, a plastic cup of coffee in the other. He wasn't looking at the palace. He wasn't admiring the architecture. His attention was locked onto the guards. His camera was already rolling. He hadn't come to see the royal guard. He had come to put on a show. A young American blogger, known for his provocative videos, felt like the main star of this stage. He saw people exchanging glances, pointing at him. He noticed that some tourists were already paying attention to his camera, and he loved it. But just filming a video about the guards? Too boring. He needed something more, content, a reaction, something that would explode on the internet. And he already knew exactly what he was going to do. First, the small provocations. He stepped closer to the barrier, standing just a couple of meters from one of the guards. Sergeant Daniel Harris, a man in his early 30s, tall, strong, with sharp facial features and piercing eyes staring into the void. He stood perfectly still, just like hundreds of guards before him. Just like hundreds of guards after him. The blogger smirked. He knew these guys weren't allowed to react to provocation. This was his chance. He took a few more steps forward. The crowd around him continued its usual chatter, but some tourists started watching him with caution. He waved his hand right in front of Harris's face. No reaction. The smirk widened. Some people tensed. Someone pulled out their phone, sensing that something bigger was about to happen. But Harris didn't move a millimeter, and that infuriated the blogger. He was used to people reacting, used to his jokes triggering laughter, emotions, some kind of response. But in front of him stood a man who could not be broken. And that irritated him. If he couldn't make him smile or turn his head, maybe he could make him react in another way. He stepped forward. Too close now. The crowd fell silent. The blogger could feel the shift in energy around him. People were no longer looking at him with curiosity. They were looking at him with concern. But he didn't notice. He was too focused on his video, too unaware that he had just crossed the line where jokes no longer applied. The crowd in front of the palace began murmuring. At first, it all seemed like a harmless prank. Tourists were used to seeing people test the royal guard's patience. Sometimes it was kids making faces at the soldiers, sometimes over-enthusiastic visitors trying to make them laugh. But today felt different. Normally, these attempts ended quickly. A few silly gestures, a couple of photos, and then people moved on. But this guy wasn't just a random tourist. He hadn't come just to see the guards. He had come to make himself the center of attention. The blogger knew that the Royal Guard was all about discipline, cold resilience, and self-control. But he didn't believe that a person could truly remain this unshakable. He could already picture it in his head. Him provoking the guard, capturing his reaction, the video going viral, and him becoming the internet sensation of the day. The crowd was already watching him, and that was all he needed. Now he controlled their attention. He stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. The guard in front of him remained utterly motionless. Perfect posture, hands gripping the rifle tightly, eyes fixed straight ahead, no sign of irritation or discomfort. That infuriated the blogger. He was used to being in control, used to people reacting, getting annoyed, playing into his provocations. But this guard wasn't playing his game. The blogger tilted his head to the side and glanced at his phone camera. "Come on, at least blink," he muttered with a smirk, waving his hand in front of the guard's face. Nothing. Not a single movement. The crowd whispered. Some tourists exchanged uneasy glances. An elderly woman frowned. A man beside her shook his head. A young couple nearby stopped smiling. People could feel that this was crossing the line from playful teasing into something else. But the blogger didn't notice. He only saw himself, his camera, the likes and views that were about to flood in. He didn't care what the crowd thought. He had his goal. He waved his hand again, sharper, more aggressive. Silence. Harris didn't even blink. The blogger felt something unfamiliar. Annoyance. His tricks always worked. He had messed with waiters, police officers, store clerks, anyone. People always reacted. But this guard refused to play along. He was like a statue, and that threw him off. Now, the crowd wasn't looking at the guard. They were looking at the blogger, at the guy trying to put on a show but looking more and more ridiculous with each second. But he didn't realize it. He turned back to the camera, forcing another smirk. Maybe he's not even real. Should we check? But something had changed. Some tourists had moved away, not wanting to be part of whatever was about to happen. Someone shook their head in irritation. Someone muttered quietly, "Why is he doing this?" But the blogger didn't hear them. He was too focused on his goal. Now, all attention was on him. He couldn't just stop. He had to push further, and that's when he made his fatal mistake. He reached out and touched the guard's rifle. Not hard, not aggressively, just a light tap. But it was enough. The crowd gasped. No one had expected him to go that far. An elderly woman covered her mouth with her hand. A man who had been filming suddenly lowered his phone. A girl with a camera froze, unsure of what to do next. That was the moment the fun ended. He didn't realize that he had just changed everything. Didn't understand that his story was now heading in a completely different direction. But he would in the next second. The moment his fingers touched the rifle, the world seemed to freeze. The crowd, which had been murmuring and chattering just a second ago, fell into tense silence. Then, the guard moved. Sharply. Swiftly. Lightning fast. The blogger barely had time to register what was happening before a loud, commanding voice rang out. "Stand back!" It wasn't just a voice. It was an order. The sound thundered across the square, echoed off the palace walls, and hit with such force that people instinctively stepped back. Some tourists flinched. Others recoiled on reflex. The blogger froze. And then the guardsman stepped forward. One sharp, threatening step. The heavy stomp of his boot against the pavement cut through the air like a gunshot. And in an instant, the rifle barrel was in the blogger's face. The crowd gasped. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. Just seconds ago, their cameras had been capturing a light-hearted spectacle. Now, they were recording something entirely different. Some hands trembled, their phones shaking. Others involuntarily took a step back. The same people who had been laughing at the blogger just moments ago now stood in stunned silence. And he stood there, face to face with an unmoving, emotionless expression. and for the first time, he realized that the situation was no longer in his control. He was no longer directing the show. He was part of it. A cold chill spread through his body. He could feel the panic rising inside him. All the fun had vanished in an instant. Only now did he understand that he had done something that should never have been done. He had crossed a line where there were no more jokes. The blogger couldn't tear his eyes away from the rifle barrel. It was right there, so close, and there was nothing fake about it. This was a weapon, real, loaded, ready. The guardsman said nothing more. He just stood there, cold and composed, aiming the rifle directly at him. That gaze didn't threaten with words. It was worse. It said, "You don't matter anymore. You are no longer in control. You put yourself in this position." The crowd remained silent. But this wasn't the silence of anticipation, nor was it the silence of indifference. This was real tension. Some people were only now realizing how serious this was. A young woman nearby turned visibly pale, covering her mouth with her hands. A man who had been filming quickly put away his phone, as if suddenly aware that he was recording something forbidden. Someone muttered under their breath, "He's screwed." The blogger heard everything. His body refused to move. The guardsman didn't make any sudden movements, but everything about his stance, his gaze, made it clear that one more step, one more mistake, and the consequences would be far worse. For the first time, the blogger didn't feel like the main character. For the first time, he felt like a fool. Sweat trickled down his back. His throat was dry. Just a second ago, he was convinced he was making the best video of his life. Now, he had only one thought. How do I get out of this without ruining everything? But the crowd had already made its judgment. They had all seen his humiliation, and the cameras were still rolling, and at that moment he understood. Even if he walked away right now, this moment would haunt him forever. The blogger couldn't move. His entire body was frozen, numb from shock. The crowd held its breath, waiting, and he had no idea what to do. Before him stood the guardsman, rifle raised, unwavering. But the worst part wasn't the weapon. The worst part was the face. Cold, emotionless, completely certain. This man wasn't afraid of him, wasn't angry, wasn't even annoyed. He was just waiting for the blogger to understand his mistake. And the blogger did. A tight knot of fear coiled in his stomach. How had he let it go this far? Why hadn't he stopped earlier? He had come here for content. But now, his video wasn't about him cleverly pranking a guardsman. Now, it was a video of him getting humiliated. And the cameras were still rolling. Shattered expectations. The blogger didn't know what to expect next. He had expected the guardsman to snap, to yell at him, to demand he leave. He had expected security to rush in, tackle him, call the police. If they had fined him, escorted him out, even arrested him, he could have made it a show, turned himself into a victim of the system. But none of that happened. The guardsman just stood there, silent, unshaken, looking through him as if the blogger was nothing. That was the worst part. He wasn't even worth anger, not even worth irritation. He was nothing. The crowd makes its judgment, and the crowd understood that too. At first, some people had laughed, admired his boldness. But now everyone knew who the winner was and who the fool was. A different kind of attention. He could feel their eyes on him, but this time there was no admiration. Now they looked at him with disgust, with disdain, with open disapproval. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a brave provocateur. He was an idiot who had put himself in a humiliating situation. He could see people shaking their heads, hear someone scoff, notice others stifling laughter. But now, the laughter wasn't with him. They were laughing at him. The final step into shame. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't stand under these eyes any longer. But he knew. The moment he moved, it would be the final admission of defeat. Still, he couldn't just stand there. He took a step back. One. Another. The crowd didn't look away. He tried to move smoothly, confidently, but his legs were shaking. The crowd finishes him off. Then someone laughed loudly. "Where's the joke now, bro?" More laughter. Quiet, restrained. But to him, it was deafening. He gritted his teeth but said nothing. He couldn't say anything. The guardsman's silent victory. But the worst part wasn't that. The worst part happened next. The moment he stepped past the invisible boundary. The guardsman silently stepped back and resumed his stance, as if nothing had happened, as if the blogger had never existed. And in that moment, he realized this man wouldn't remember his face, wouldn't recall his name, wouldn't think about him for a single second. He was nothing. But the internet wouldn't forget. But to the world, he was now everything, because every camera was still on him. And by tomorrow, his face would be everywhere. He hadn't filmed a viral video. He had become one. And this moment would never disappear. He walked quickly, almost at the edge of running, but refused to let himself break into a sprint. Each step echoed in his ears. The crowd behind him said nothing now. No shouting, no jeering, no applause. But he could still feel their eyes. A searing, prickling sensation, like dozens of invisible gazes burning into his back. He knew no one would stop him. And somehow, that made it worse. He was no longer someone worth watching. People no longer saw him as bold. Now he was just another fool who had destroyed his own status. The show was over, but its consequences were only just beginning. He reached a deserted alley and stopped. His hands were shaking. His breathing was unsteady. Something inside him felt deeply wrong. And it wasn't just the humiliation he had just endured. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was no longer in control of his own fate. He used to dictate attention. He decided what to post, what to show the world, what image to create. But now, his face, his failure, his disgrace, was in their hands. And there was nothing he could do about it. He pulled out his phone. He didn't want to open social media, but he had to know. It had already begun. He opened the first video. Hundreds of thousands of views, thousands of comments. Every frame of his humiliation was spreading across the internet. It was already too late. He watched himself from the outside, the cocky smirk as he approached the guard, the arrogant wave of his hand in front of the soldier's face, the reckless reach toward something he should have never touched, and then, his expression shifting, the self-confidence vanishing. Him standing there frozen, as the guard remained stone-faced and immovable, as the crowd made its judgment. This is so satisfying. Dude got exactly what he deserved. Every new comment made him feel worse. He scrolled, hoping, praying, to find even a single word of defense. There were none. Everyone who saw this video either condemned him, laughed at him, or outright despised him. He was no longer the creator of content. He had become the content. But not as a winner, as the fool, as the anti-hero. He wanted to erase everything. But it was impossible. The video had already spread to hundreds of accounts. Thousands of people had downloaded it, saved it, shared it with friends. It no longer belonged to him. Now it was part of the internet, part of his past, one he could never outrun. He shut his eyes. One thought echoed in his mind. It's over. Then the messages came. Friends, other influencers, journalists, memes. He didn't want to see them, but he knew they existed. Someone had already screenshotted his stunned face. Someone had added the caption, "That moment when you realize you messed up." Someone had slowed down the footage of him stepping backward, adding dramatic music. Every second, he was losing the reputation he had spent years building. He was no longer a famous blogger. Now he was a joke, but the worst part wasn't the memes, it was the news. He opened his feed. First headline, "Tourist tries to touch a Royal Guard's rifle, instantly regrets it." Second, "Another blogger who didn't know when to stop." Third, "The guard didn't flinch, but the tourist will remember this forever." His name was in the headlines. His face was on the front pages. It was official. He was a public embarrassment. He stood up, shoved his phone into his pocket, and clenched his fists. He had to do something. But what? Explain? Deny? Delete his accounts? Pointless. This wouldn't go away. This day was now part of history. He walked down the street, avoiding eye contact. Anyone could recognize him now. Anyone could have seen the video. Anyone could already know. He was that idiot from the internet. He felt dirty, exposed, a stranger in a city that no longer belonged to him. And in that moment, he understood. He was no longer in London. London was in him. This city would never forget him. Not as a blogger, as a tourist who made the biggest mistake of his life. London moved on. The streets were filled with cars. People rushed about their day. Tourists snapped photos as if nothing had happened. The city didn't stop, didn't pause, didn't care about those who came and went. But for one man, time had frozen. In a cheap hotel room on the outskirts of the city, the blogger sat on the bed, staring at his phone screen. His social media feed was overflowing with his own face. His humiliation had gone global. The internet was flooded with discussions, memes, and comments. He tried not to read them, but his eyes caught every new post. It was always the same. His cocky grin at the start. And then, the moment it all changed, the moment he lost control, the moment he realized he was no longer in charge. Yesterday, he had been certain he controlled everything. He was the one who shaped the narrative, who dictated how people saw him. Today, he was nothing but a topic of conversation. People turned him into a joke, edited clips, layered music over his retreat, made slow-motion compilations under titles like, "How Not to Behave in London." The best response to a rude tourist. He couldn't stop it. Even if he deleted all his accounts, even if he disappeared, even if he changed his name. The video had spread too far. It no longer belonged to him. He closed his eyes and leaned back, exhaling deeply. This day was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had come to London expecting to create something legendary. Something that would make him more famous, more admired, more talked about. He thought his boldness, his provocations, would once again earn him praise. He thought he could control the attention, twist the situation in his favor. But it had all gone wrong. He had made a mistake. 1 second, he had believed he was untouchable. The next, he had become the world's laughingstock. The video's view count kept rising. It had gone beyond his audience. Now, it was in the news. Journalists were writing about modern tourists who disrespected tradition. Commenters shared stories of arrogant travelers who thought the world revolved around them. He wasn't just being mocked. He had become a symbol of arrogance and foolishness, silenced by tradition. Somewhere across the city, in front of Buckingham Palace, the guardsman remained at his post. He hadn't checked the news. He hadn't seen the memes. He probably didn't even know he was part of a viral video. For him, today was just another day. He stood, unmoving, doing his duty. Tourists passed by, snapping pictures, admiring the uniforms, taking videos. But today, no one tried to provoke the guards. No one waved their hands in their faces. No one reached for their weapons. People kept their distance. They had seen the video. They knew what had happened here yesterday. They knew the guards didn't yell, didn't hit, didn't break composure. But if you crossed the line, you'd realize your mistake immediately. The guardsman remained still, a symbol of unwavering discipline. No one knew what he was thinking, if he was thinking at all. But one thing was certain. He hadn't changed. He wouldn't remember that blogger's face. He wouldn't remember his name. He wouldn't give him another second of thought, because to him that man didn't matter. But to the internet, he always would.